Well, Thursday. There's one word that I would use to describe today. It would be the word service. Sunday we saw Jesus as King. Monday we saw Jesus as Judge. To have faith in Jesus is to invite him to test and transform our hearts. Tuesday we saw Jesus as worthy of worship. To have faith in Jesus is to pour out our lives in love and devotion to him. Wednesday we saw Jesus as coming back. To have faith in Jesus is to put our trust in him and him alone, to cling to him, and no matter what, to accept no substitutes for him. This morning I want to consider how this God and King was about to pour out his life unto death so that he could satisfy God's wrath against sinners. As Philippians 2 reminds us, Jesus was God and enjoyed all the privileges of God, and yet he made himself nothing and became a man. And as a man, he became a slave. And as a slave, he gave himself completely unto death, even to the most horrifying kind of death on a cross. The passage I have in mind is only found in the Gospel of John, and that shouldn't surprise us. The Apostle John became well known as the Apostle of Love. Just think about this man who in his younger days wanted to call down fire from heaven to judge the Samaritans. This man who was known as the Son of Thunder was so transformed by Jesus' love that he became known as the Apostle of Love. The passage is John 13. John 13, a well-known passage, and yet we don't often think about it and talk about it. Jesus washing his disciples' feet. John chapter 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. This is the context of the Passover. It's the last meal that Jesus would enjoy on the night in which he would be betrayed. And it tells us that the motive for everything that was about to unfold was love. Jesus loved them, and he loved them to the end. It says in verse 2, during the supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. It's interesting here that this note is made because it's reminding us that Jesus knew his disciples. He knew each one of them. He knew what was in their heart. He knew Peter was going to betray him. He knew that they would all flee from him. He knew Judas would betray him. Jesus knew that these disciples weren't worthy of his love. They weren't worthy of his devotion and his sacrifice. He was making this sacrifice knowingly. And then as verse 3, it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking up a towel, he tied it around his waist. Jesus does this act of service knowing who he is, knowing that he's from God and that he's going back to God, knowing all the privilege he enjoyed as God, knowing the sacrifice he was about to make. He chooses to wash the disciples' feet as a prefigurement, a sign and symbol of that sacrifice. Again, this is Philippians 2, really put in different words, put in John's words, stated another way, and demonstrated in a very personal way what Jesus was about to do. The cross for him was personal. And that's what this washing of the feet reminds us of. It wasn't just about a death for unknown sinners. It was about a sacrificial service, a washing that was very personal and specific for Jesus. And so he comes and he rises from supper in verse 4, and he goes around to each one. Verse 5, and he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered him, what I'm going to do, you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. And as he goes around to each one, it's very personal and specific, and he washes their feet. And in Jesus' mind, he understands that this is just a symbol. He says, you don't actually even understand it yet. They're shocked by this. This isn't the job of a master, of a lord, of a teacher, of a rabbi, certainly not of the Messiah. This is the job of the lowest of servants, the household servant. And Jesus performs that job on their behalf. And they're so shocked by that, horrified, humiliated even, that they don't want any part of it. They're struggling to let Jesus do this. And when he comes to Peter, Peter doesn't want to accept it at all. And Jesus says, you don't even understand the least of it. They're shocked by this kind of washing, but this is just a symbol, a prefigurement of a greater washing that Jesus is about to do, to wash his disciples from their sin, to satisfy the wrath of God against sin, to be a sacrifice, a substitute in their place, to be filthied with their sin, so that he could wash them clean with his righteousness. And he realizes that only after the cross, and as the disciples begin to contemplate and meditate on what he's about to do, only then will they understood what this washing here symbolized. So Jesus comes to Peter, and Peter says to him, you shall never wash my feet, in verse 8. And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. And Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet. That is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, not all of you are clean. And yeah, Peter says to Jesus, you're not going to wash my feet. No ways, Lord. And Jesus says, no one who belongs to me is exempt. Anyone who believes in Jesus must humble himself and accept this washing, which Jesus alone can give. And when Peter realizes that, then he's saying, well, Lord, wash all of me. Wash everything. And Peter goes the other extreme and says, well, if it's washing that I need in order to belong to you and be known as yours, then wash my whole body. And again, Jesus is not talking about the foot washing. He's talking about what the foot washing symbolizes, the spiritual washing that he would perform by dying for them on the cross. And then Jesus makes it really practical here. He says, when he had washed their feet in verse 12 and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. Jesus here says, in many ways, once we've been washed by him, once we've accepted this service that he does for us, that he alone can do to cleanse us from our sin, yet after that, we should then be like him. We should wash one another's feet. We should serve one another. I could have used the term love, because what Jesus is doing here is an expression of love. It's unconditional love. They don't deserve it, and he knows it. And he gives them what they most need, which is a spiritual washing, symbolized in this physical washing. He gives them forgiveness. He gives them his very body and life and righteousness, that they might be reconciled to the Father. And yet he says, if you have received this from me freely, you need to give freely. You need to love unconditionally. You need to love sacrificially. You need to love practically, just as I have loved you. I use the term service because in our minds, love can sometimes seem like an emotion, but service, that's practical. Jesus is calling his disciples to love like he loves, unconditionally and sacrificially and practically. That we would love one another with the same kind of love with which he has loved us. Have you been washed by Jesus? Have you received his unconditional love? Then how can you love with his kind of love today? Who can you love today?